Welcome to the Nick Hilera Show. This is the place where we explore big ideas with people having a big impact on our world. I'm your host, Nick Hilera, serial entrepreneur, author, early morning riser, and seeker of truth and wisdom. Join me as we explore the journeys and discoveries of fascinating people who are literally unlocking the secrets to creating a life of both success and fulfillment. Each episode will arm you with insights, ideas, and practical perspectives on what it takes not only to be financially and personally successful, but also how to start having authentic impact on the world around you. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Nick Hilera Show. Thanks for tuning in. We're taking a break from our summer finance series this week to cover an equally important topic, the proliferation of bias in the media. Our guest today is Isaac Saul, the creator of Tangle, a popular daily newsletter and podcast that seeks to provide independent, non-partisan coverage of American politics. Over the last several years, Isaac has built up an impressive following of over 65,000 daily readers and has become one of the most important voices in America today. I wanted to have Isaac on the show because I think he's really onto something with Tangle and believe what he's doing is pivotal for the revitalization of our American democracy. The Fourth Estate, a necessary component of any democracy, almost didn't survive the arrival of the internet and social media. I say almost because people like Isaac are proving that there's still genuine demand out there for rational, civil, political engagement. While the internet may have broken the business model of the news and introduced scary threats like the echo chamber effect, clickbait, and fake news, a new frontier has emerged and creators like Isaac are paving the way. In this engaging discussion, we cover the ins and outs of the Tangle newsletter, the inspiring origin story behind it, how Isaac goes about the not-so-easy task of trying to develop an unbiased perspective, and much, much more. As always, thanks for tuning in, and hope you enjoy. Isaac, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Nick. Glad to be here.
I've been following your work for probably about a year now, and I've really enjoyed getting your newsletter every day. It's so thorough, it's so long, and long in a good way, because it covers things. And why don't we start with, what is Tangle? Let's get into the details.
Yeah, for sure. So the basic premise of the newsletter is actually pretty straightforward. The idea is we introduce a topic that's being debated in kind of the national political scene here in the United States. And we try and give a breakdown of the topic in the most neutral language possible. And then we explicitly share some opinion pieces from the left and some opinion pieces from the right. And then as kind of an act of transparency, I, as the author of the newsletter, will share my own perspective about the debate and some of the arguments that are happening. And the idea for me was basically, I didn't see a news organization anywhere that I felt was properly representing the full scope of the views that existed out there in the United States, in one place at least. So I'm a political journalist. That's my background. I started as a sports reporter in college and then became a political reporter after I graduated. And I found when I was reporting on a story or I was reading about a story that I wasn't reporting on, in order to really get the full picture, I would have to go to the New York Times, then go to the Wall Street Journal, then go to the Washington Post, then go to Fox News, then go to Huffington Post, then go to Breitbart, and then read a few opinion pieces from all around, and then watch a YouTube video. And then I'd be like, all right, now I think I actually have this holistic look at the issue. And it was just nuts to me that didn't exist in one place. And so I had this sort of simple format idea to resolve this problem, which was basically giving 3 summaries of 3 pieces from the left and 3 from the right on one really divisive topic, so people could kind of get a really full spectrum look at what was happening in the news and what people were arguing over.
Yeah, and you're also podcasting now too. That's relatively new. So there's a daily email, which I highly recommend everyone who listens to this should subscribe to it. And there's also a podcast which people can access.
Yeah. And we now have a YouTube channel as well, which I'm really excited about because that's a space that I think is constantly growing and is also a sort of younger and oftentimes more open-minded audience, I think, that we really want to tap into. And we have our first live event coming up in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania on August 3rd for any of your listeners who might hear this before then or in the Philly area. So yeah, we're expanding slowly but surely and kind of moving into other platforms after starting as a newsletter.
And if I tried to figure this out, but you have something like what, 60 or 70,000 daily readers?
Yeah, so our mailing list now on the main newsletter is somewhere in the 65,000 ballpark. We have another kind of audience, I think of 5 or 6,000 listeners on the podcast. And we just had our first kind of breakthrough on YouTube, which was awesome. We had a video that got something like 15,000 views. So in the big grand media scheme of things, still kind of a smaller fish swimming upstream, but certainly when I started this, if you had told me we'd be here today, I would have been absolutely thrilled. And I am absolutely thrilled because I think we're trying to do something that inherently makes it really hard to build an audience because we're kind of turning the temperature down on the news a little bit. We're avoiding clickbait and hysterics and all the things that are the really easy tricks to grow an audience, which makes it really hard to create shareable content that kind of invites people in. And instead, we've organically built a list of people that are really enthusiastic about sort of a new way to consume the news and are interested in being challenged and being open-minded and encountering and engaging arguments that they might not agree with, which I think is like a really special thing. And I'm super proud of the fact that we've built that.
Yeah, and rightfully so. I mean, look, to me, it's incredibly impressive and also an optimistic story. The fact that there are 65,000 people out there who take the time to read something as thoroughly put together as the newsletter makes me optimistic. I feel like media is sort of dumbed down in our age for the wrong reason. It's not that there's not demand for intelligent conversation. It's just that it's easier to make money on the internet doing those other things that you mentioned. But there's a big group of people out there. I don't know how big this audience is. I'd be curious actually to get your perspective. But I believe there's a big group of people who want to engage with media like yours that's serious. It's entertaining as well, but it's focused on something important like democracy and engagement as a citizen. What's your take?
Yeah, 100%. Still to this day, one of the most common complaints that we get from people is that the newsletter's too long because an average newsletter probably takes 10 to 15 minutes for most people to read. And I think that the reason for that is because email newsletters generally are all about condensing things into these little 2 or 3 minute news bites. So if people are getting content in their email inbox, that's what they're used to getting. And B, I think that's happening more broadly across the entire space. And I think it's actually a misread of the situation by a lot of media executives and people who are making decisions about what content to put out. I think people are really interested in nuance right now. I think there's a growing desire for people to leave a media consumption experience feeling like they have a really well-rounded understanding of what's going on and feeling like they could go talk about the issue with friends or family members or whatever, because it's fun to be informed and fun to feel like you understand something maybe you didn't understand 15 or 20 minutes ago. I remember in the days of kind of Facebook driving all the media traffic, and that used to be the thing everybody was chasing was Facebook traffic. One of my favorite stats from that era was that long form content was actually the most shared content of that whole era. It wasn't like the cat videos and the kind of the Upworthy BuzzFeed stuff that used to be really popular in the listicles. It was really good long form investigative journalism because it's not just that people enjoy reading that stuff, it's that they also want other people to know that they read that stuff. They want other people to know that they're informed and they're trying to inform themselves. It's sort of like this virtue signal, but a kind of virtue signal that I'm all about because it's people who want to be educated and want to feel like they're engaged. There's a period of time where people's expectations have to change a little bit. And I understand if you're somebody who's only been reading The Skim or Axios or these other newsletters that give you the news in 2.5 minutes, that you open our newsletter and it's a little daunting to see this wall of text. but our open rates are industry best. They're above 60% most weeks on an average newsletter, which for a mailing list of our size is basically unheard of. And the engagement's really strong, and we lose very few subscribers. We make most of our money off paid subscriptions. We have over 10,000 paid subscribers who are paying yearly or monthly subscriptions. And on a month-to-month rate, less than 1% of those subscribers cancel their subscription. So 99% of our paid subscribers are staying on, which to me is proof of the fact that once people get a taste of this kind of content, they really love it and they'll stick around.
Yeah, that's super encouraging. And I think as a reader, I think one of the things that is super effective that you are doing is the bullet points, because there are some issues where I'll read the entire thing because I'm super interested in it. But there are others where it's like, okay, this is a good issue to cover, but let me just get the bullets. And the bullets are incredibly helpful. So I appreciate that feature.
Yeah, that was something we didn't have when we started. And it was a request that I got from readers, was like, hey, I open your email every day, but there are literally days when I just have 5 minutes and I don't have 15 minutes. I wish I could scan the email and then just read your take or whatever. And I'm certainly conscious of the fact that a lot of people don't have 15 minutes, whatever, in the middle of their day to sit down with our newsletter. But I also want it to be something that people can consume in different ways. So if they want to read it top to bottom, every word twice over and spend 30 minutes with it, there's plenty there to chew on. And if they've got 5 minutes and they want to get an idea of what the hell is going on out there because it's so complicated these days, we can be that resource too. So yeah, that was something I did not have in the beginning. And it's cool to hear you say that as a reader, that is helpful, because it was a feature that I just got the request for from readers. And I was like, you know what, would be pretty easy to do and seems like a really helpful thing.
Yeah, another positive, and this whole interview is not going to be a sell for people to get Tangle, but this is
that's okay. Let's do that. Let's make the whole thing a sell.
But this is genuine. So, from my own perspective, every once in a while, I think about subscribing to all these newspapers because I love the news. It's one of my favorite things to do is read the news and stuff. But then I'm like, you know what? Isaac is going to cover that. So I don't need to read 50 articles because I can just go get the bullet points and actual quotes directly from that. So I think that's another incredible benefit of what you're doing, is that if you don't have time or you don't have the resources to go and read the Wall Street Journal and all these other publications, you can subscribe to Tangle and get a pretty good picture every single day of, not every issue, obviously, because you're only covering one issue per day, but I think it's a super big benefit of Tangle.
I appreciate you saying that. There is a part of me that also wants to make it really clear that what I do is not possible without a lot of the other news organizations that are out there, because a lot of times I'm sourcing their content and aggregating the content that they put out. But yeah, I recognize the fact that some people can't pay $200 a year, whatever it is, for a Wall Street Journal subscription, and certainly can't do that 10 times over again to subscribe to every news outlet that's out there, which is part of the reason actually why we make pretty much 80% of our content free. Our Monday through Thursday newsletter, anybody can read just by signing up, and we only paywall that one edition a week. So it's definitely designed to be a place where you can get a look at a huge range of news outlets that are out there, even the ones that are behind paywalls for a lot of people.
Well, I want to get into some of the interesting dynamics of Tangle and what you've learned over the last 4 years writing it. But before we do that, just one final question kind of about the origin. Like, take me back to before you ever thought up Tangle. What was your life plan? It sounds like you had always kind of wanted to be a journalist, but I'm curious how you got interested in this and how you ended up at that moment in time where you say, let me try to write this newsletter.
Yeah, sure. A really big origin story and a huge part of all this for me is that I grew up in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, which is a bellwether county just north of Philadelphia. And then I went to school at the University of Pittsburgh in Western PA. So Bucks County is, when I was in high school, is what I always tell people. I remember the national news outlets coming to our town to do the diner interviews with people to get an idea of who was going to win an election. And it's still true today. Bucks is a little bit bluer now, I think, than it used to be, but Pennsylvania obviously is a battleground state. typically whoever wins Pennsylvania wins the presidential election. So I grew up immersed in that environment of really divisive politics in a state that was really important to what was happening nationally. And as a result, a lot of my friends and family came from really different political places. I could be sitting at lunch with kids who were totally opposite side of the political spectrum, which I don't think is something that's true in a lot of American communities today. And then I went to University of Pittsburgh, which is Western PA, kind of this blue collar working class city known for iron and steel and unions, and surrounded in Western Pennsylvania, which is Kentucky, basically. There's this huge melting pot of political diversity that exists out there as well. So I took all of that and then went into my career as a political journalist, which was kind of an accident. I went to school to be an athletic trainer. I hated the pre-med courses and loved my writing classes, and then went and applied for a job at the school paper, became a sports reporter, and then it kind of just snowballed from there. And when I went into professional journalism, I went to newsrooms like the Huffington Post was the first job I ever had, which was not because I was like a bleeding heart lib, despite the fact that the Huffington Post is a news outlet with a very strong left-leaning tilt. It was because I applied to 40 places. They're the only ones that got me a job. And the result of that experience was seeing that there are newsrooms like the Huffington Post where pretty much everybody in the newsroom shares one political orientation and comes from some pretty specific backgrounds, educationally, economically, whatever. And I saw that and was like, this seems broken. This is definitely not right. And you can see it in the content they put out. And that's not a knock on Huffington Post journalists. I know a lot of reporters who work there still to this day who do excellent work, but it's a systemic thing. They exist in this marketplace to offer the sort of left-wing tilt on the news. And we exist now in a media ecosystem where basically every news organization has picked a side like that. Every news organization is trying to represent a certain demographic. Like the Wall Street Journal is for right of center, moderate, conservative Republicans now. And the New York Times is for highly educated liberals. And Breitbart is for the pro-Trump working class right. You can go through every news organization. Pretty much I can give you a general stereotype of their audience. And that's not good. As a reporter and a writer, I realized that depending on where I was publishing news, I was speaking to one consistent kind of audience, and I wanted to change that. And that was fundamental to the origins of Tangle. And the fact that I had the background I did growing up in Bucks County and having this sort of like political incongruence of my own made me feel like I was sort of well positioned to do that. And I think humbly, I think the product is proof of that. I think I am making contact with people from across the political spectrum who really trust the news we're putting out and feel like their voices are being represented in what we're doing.
Hey guys, this is Nick. I wanted to take a quick break from the episode to share some exciting news. In addition to the podcast, I want to make you aware of some additional content we're putting out. And best of all, it's 100% free. Our Profit Plus newsletter consists of weekly insights about what it takes to find meaning in the pursuit of modern success. This is the place where we explore big ideas at the intersection of markets, business, politics, and life as we seek to empower our readers to have an authentic impact on the world. If you're serious about finding fulfillment amid success, then definitely check out these additional insights. Just go to subscribe.nickhilaris.com. Again, that's subscribe.nickhilaris.com. Now let's get back to the episode. What does your family from Bucks County think about Tangle? Because it sounds like the family has a diverse political viewpoints, and I'm curious what they think.
Yeah, no, totally. They are super supportive, love the product. I think my dad actually is a kind of unpaid editor on the newsletter. He was my first ever editor. When it was just me, he used to just check it for typos and all this stuff. And now we've grown and we have a staff and I have a payroll and people I pay, but I still let him in the document every morning and he helps me edit the newsletter. He and my mom are candidly both unabashed liberals. They're Democrats through and through. And I think watching my political orientation shift as I got older was in the beginning a little bit scary for them because I definitely moved a lot more to the center. But I think now that they see the product I'm putting out and the stances I take, I feel like I'm actually moving them on a lot of things. I think we have a nice little exchange of ideas and conflict and friction because they're kind of old school Democrats. They were marching in the 60s for civil rights and those kinds of things where they see the Democratic Party today and don't recognize a lot of things about it, which is true of a lot of voters their age. So it's really interesting and complex, but overall, huge levels of support, not just from the nuclear family, but more expansive. Even my conservative religious cousins and family and the family I have in rural West Texas and all across the board, they love it. They feel like it's a good thing for the country. And I think they're probably representative of most people. Like, I think a lot of people don't trust the news right now and feel like it's broken and they want a new offering. And so we're trying to take advantage of that feeling for sure.
That's such a cool story. It's funny how it all makes sense when you look in the other direction after the fact. This is a perfect example of that.
Yeah, no, 100%. I could not have predicted I would land here now 10 years ago, but it feels like a lot of things happen that kind of helped me be made for this moment.
Well, you mentioned just a second ago, and you also mentioned it in today's newsletter that came out, that the central problem is that people don't trust the news, right? I was interviewing Martin Wolf, who's the Financial Times columnist, because he wrote a new book called The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism. And essentially, I was interviewing about the book, and it was a super fascinating conversation. But in the book, he talks a lot about the fourth estate and the challenges that it's had in the internet era and how, in his view, as someone on the inside, it's not functioning. When do you think this started to go wrong? How far back do you have to rewind the clock? Do you got to go back before the internet came about, when things start to look different? And just, I'm curious to get your take on the evolution of the problem.
Yeah, I think there are a few things that have kind of intersected to make it as bad as it has gotten. First of all, the most recent to me is definitely the advent of social media and the way that social media has driven news traffic and profitability and incentives. The simple equation is you have an advertiser who has an ad on a web page that you have. The more people who see that ad, the more money you make, which means you want to make that web page as viral as possible. And when the thing that the advertisement exists around is a news article, there are a lot of really tricky incentives that come into play, which is how can we get as many people as possible to read this article and share it and look at it and click on it? And that's just the simple math. And that's a force that nobody really cared about pushing back against, or I think really understood how to push back against 10 years ago. And so it was just like, get clicks, get shares. And if we have to add a word to the headline to make it a little more controversial or a little more sensational or whatever, then it was worth it because we'd triple the views of the article and we'd make a bunch of money off of it. And that's a top-down thing that's happening at news organizations from the editorial perspective. And then from the business side, putting pressure on the editorial side, which is we're not making money or we don't have enough subscribers. And everybody knows that if a news organization is in the red, they're going to cut the journalists, the people who are on the content side. And the content creators understand that. So they know driving traffic and hitting traffic goals and all this stuff that's their job security. And so it's this really messy thing I experienced firsthand. I think a lot of reporters, even at the best media outlets, have experienced firsthand. The bottom up problem on the other side of that I think existed well before the internet and has really gotten worse is that journalism today it's not a working class job anymore. I think there was a period of time decades ago when there were a lot of people who got into journalism who maybe didn't have a bachelor's degree or maybe just got their journalism degree and went to some state school or local community college or whatever, or fell into journalism because they wrote a story that kind of blew up. My experience has been in the media world, and there's a ton of data to reflect this. I wish I had some of the surveys offhand, but the vast majority of people who are working in media today are people who went to four-year colleges, often expensive schools, grew up in more wealthy families, because when they graduate college, they could go take a really crappy unpaid internship at the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal and not worry about making rent. And a lot of them have graduate degrees. And so they're coming out of super highly educated schools, highly educated backgrounds, and going from that into journalism, which in a vacuum is not a problem. It's like, what's the issue? There's people who are really well educated going into journalism. That's a great thing. The issue is that in today's America, the biggest political divide we have, one of the biggest predictors of somebody's political allegiance, is their level of education. So we have a media ecosystem that is populated predominantly by highly educated people who statistically are much, much, much more likely to be liberal than they are conservative. And that's just the reality of the situation we're in. I'm not prescribing any specific solution to it, but I've freelanced for and worked inside enough news publications, and I know enough people at enough news publications to know that that's not what's coming out on the other side of that is exactly what you'd expect, which is most journalists at most newsrooms are people who vote for Democrats and are liberally minded. And so the response we got to that was Fox News and Breitbart and the Daily Caller and Ben Shapiro and all this stuff. And now it's like the forces are kind of battling. And I think the playing field has been leveled in a lot of ways. I think conservative media occupies just as much space as the sort of traditional left-wing media, and they're very much in combat, as everybody can see. But for a long time, it was if you were a run-of-the-mill conservative in Western Pennsylvania who went to 2 years of trade school and you were reading the news, you'd be like, why are we using this language to describe this thing? Why is someone like me not being interviewed in this story? You don't see yourself in the news. You don't trust the news. You go looking for other sources. That's kind of to me, those are the two fundamental issues that have sort of intersected in the last few years. Not easy stuff to solve, but certainly we're watching the consequences of that kind of play out in real time.
The second point about the education skew, that's such an interesting point and one that I've never heard before, but it makes sense. I feel like just as a citizen of this country, it's increasingly divided on these education lines. And actually in Wolf's book, he makes an argument about the exact same point about how there's sort of a new political alliance being formed by the populist movement, like the MAGA movement, which was unusual. And it skews exactly on this education line. But I didn't realize that the journalism profession had been impacted to that degree. Is that like the last 20 years or something like that?
Yeah, I'm not. I don't want to speak out of turn and pull some kind of stat out of thin air, but so I'm not certain when that trend started for sure. But I've absolutely seen surveys and polls of thousands of journalists across the media ecosystem who the vast, vast majority of them respond that they're either Democratic or left-leaning independent voters, and they are people with high levels of college education. And just taking that and then comparing it to the people who are voting and where the political divides are in the United States today, it's pretty obvious that there's going to be a big fissure between those groups. And it's hard. I feel a little handcuffed by the language that I have to use to describe the situation. I hate saying that, oh, these journalists are highly educated. And then there's like these rubes out there in Western Pennsylvania, people who go to trade school. And I have a family member who never went to school a day in his life and lives in rural West Texas, is a brilliant mechanic and runs a nursery that sells cactuses. Literally never went to a single day of school in his entire life. He's one of the most brilliant people I've ever met, truly one of the most brilliant people I've ever met. And politically, his experience of going through life working in these places and sharing space with people who have similar backgrounds as him, it forms his identity. He's kind of a liberal who hates liberals. It's like he can't stand the way Democrats talk and kind of the policing of language and these, because he feels like they're so out of touch with what he experiences. And there's nothing we can do about that. It's just, that's how it works. The people you grow up with and the people you spend time around have a huge influence on your worldviews. And so when you have a whole class of people who are coming into a profession from really similar educational backgrounds and these kinds of spaces, all living in New York and all living in Los Angeles and all living in Chicago, which is where a huge chunk of journalists now live. It's like, yeah, you're going to get what you get. And I think that's a big reason why we saw the kind of conservative media space backlash. And I think it's why a lot of people feel like your average journalist you pluck out of the crowd is kind of detached from the reality that they're living in right now.
Let's take a quick break to hear from our sponsor. This episode of The Nick Halera Show is brought to you by Metros Capital. If you're an investor looking for direct access to real estate investments, then we'd love to talk with you. Investment opportunities at Metros Capital balance financial returns and community impact. To learn more, contact us at metros.nickhaleris.com. Again, that's metros.nickhaleris.com. Now let's get back to the episode. One of the features of Tangle that I think is super interesting is the section that you write yourself. Sort of after you summarize the issues from the various news outlets and on the left and the right, you write this section. And I was curious just to try to understand your process. How do you go about even trying to form an unbiased opinion? And how long does it take? Because it sounds like, just from reading, you must be consuming an enormous amount of written content. How do you do it every single day? And how do you keep yourself in a position where you could at least attempt to be unbiased?
Really good question. One that I'm constantly kind of gut checking myself on. I consume an unbelievable amount of news content, not just written content, but watching the late night shows, the primetime TV lineups, because it's important to see what most of America is getting from Fox News and CNN and MSNBC, listening to podcasts, all that stuff. So generally speaking, the process of actually creating the newsletter does a ton of work for me, because I'm seeking out views from the left and I'm seeking out views from the right in order to go out and find arguments that I think cover a lot of ground and are representative of a huge swath of the country, and then have to collect all of those and then decide which of them I think are the most compelling or interesting or will do the most to kind of inform our readers about what positions are out there. And that process alone, I'm learning all day. I'm constantly getting exposed to new ideas and new lines of argument on issues that I've been reading about for years. And so it's like I have this fundamental base knowledge, but I also know that every day there's new data and new information and new thought leaders who are kind of pushing the Overton windows in different directions. And so I'm constantly revising what my own view is and what my own perspective is on this issue. And then there's some intentional stuff that I'm really careful about that I do. First of all, if we're covering an issue that I know I have some kind of formed view on, I will start the process of putting together the newsletter by immersing myself in the counter perspective. And that is maybe the most important exercise that I do. So today is a good example. We covered the Republican decision to basically amend the NDAA with amendments that were basically defunding diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're stripping out provisions about funding for travel and time off for abortions if you're a member of the military, and then transgender healthcare. And I know I can read the headline and the nut graph of a story, and in my head, I'm like, I don't think I agree with the Republican position here. I have pro-choice, quote unquote, views about abortion that are much more born not from the morality question of abortion, but from a small government view that the government shouldn't have a role in these decisions. But knowing that going in to a story like that, I'm like, okay, I'm going to spend the first few hours of putting this newsletter together just reading the conservative opinions, intentionally finding the people out there who I know will really challenge me on this issue. And that is a really good way to poke holes and sort of stress test what my own views are. And a lot of times it breaks them. Truly, there are days, every week I have days where I go into a story and I think I understand it or think I've heard what the best argument is about it. And then I read something that's so moving and so compelling that I'm like, oh shit, I'm actually wrong. I need to sort of update where I'm going. And sometimes I write my take and then I get feedback from readers that's so compelling that I'm like, oh, they're actually right. This was kind of lazy the way I landed here. And I think the more I do that, the easier it becomes to do. It's like a muscle that I'm training. It's become so okay for me to change my view on something now that it's not nearly as hard as it was in the beginning, which I think is really healthy for me and a really good thing that I hope readers are getting out of the newsletter too. So it's a mix. Some of it's very intentional. Some of it just happens organically from the process of doing the newsletter. But at the end of the day, I have these 2 sticky notes I can see right now. They're on my computer. They're all crusted and old because they've been there for years. And one just says, keep the main thing, which is, what are we trying to do here? What's the main purpose of this newsletter? And the other one is just tell your truth. My promise to readers is not that I'm going to be moderate on every issue. It's not that I'm going to be centrist on every issue. It's that I'm going to tell them honestly what I think. And I'm not going to be scared to tell them what I think, even if I think it's going to upset them. If that's my North Star and I'm coming to my positions honestly, then I think most people will read that and they'll sense that in my take. And even if they disagree, they'll be like, at least it was thoughtful and it's clear he put time into thinking about this and considering the other side. And those are the things that I really hope to kind of put out there. There are days when I do it really well and days when I don't. And I have enough readers now that when I don't, I definitely get checked. But that's kind of how I think about in the framework I try to go into every day with.
Yeah. And look, as a reader, I think you do a great job of it. And it's fascinating to just hear you say that. In my world, my day job is I'm an investor. And there's a line of thinking that's very similar actually in investing. And it's the most famous person who talked about it is Charlie Munger, who his point of view is, if you want to make an investment decision that feels good to you, I'm going to buy Coca-Cola. The first thing you should do is deliberately expose yourself to all the reasons why you shouldn't buy Coca-Cola and see if it changes your mind. And he says something very similar to what you just said, which is that if you do that deliberate exposure to the other view for long enough, it really becomes a habit and it can make you a way better investor. And it sounds like it's been working for you over the last 4 years, just in terms of making you a more open-minded political commentator.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I've never heard that before, but it makes total sense. And it absolutely hasn't made my views more rigid. I don't come away feeling like, oh, I've read all this stuff and now I'm so confident what my perspective is. I come away feeling like, you know what? It's actually, some of this stuff is really complicated and there's a lot of nuance and it's not black and white. And there are a ton of people out there who are making really good faith arguments who I may really strongly disagree with. I have fundamental positions that are, whether they're emotional or they're tied to my personal experience or whatever, I don't agree, but I can see the line of thought and the logic, and I can see that somebody's coming to that view honestly. And going through that experience over and over again, it makes you feel like just because someone doesn't agree with you doesn't mean that they're a bad, terrible person. Sometimes I feel that way, but it's way, way, way more rare than it used to be. And the result is, I think I'm definitely a lot more open-minded than I was 4 years ago when I started this. And even then, at that time, I thought I was open-minded, but this project has it's moved my political orientation in interesting ways. And it's made me feel like there are a lot of really good faith disagreements out there among really smart people on really contentious issues. And I think we lose sight of that a lot as a country.
I feel like the other thing, just to add on to that, when you read Tangle, you understand that people really are nuanced and they don't skew on good or bad or either or. They don't even skew on left or right. So there's another feature of your newsletter, which I think is really fascinating, which is you'll take some time to share reader feedback. And what's incredible about this reader feedback is that, take, for example, you had a recent piece on the vaccine stuff and you wrote your piece on it, your take, and you get responses that some people think you're the crazy leftist and other people from responding to the same information think that you're a MAGA Trump supporter, which I find so fascinating. And I think it's proof that people don't, first of all, they don't skew that easily on the political spectrum of left and right as we think they do. And that they're capable of having viewpoints that are completely contrary to what you would expect, given where they're coming from. So it's a fascinating dynamic. And there's more than that. Any big topic that you've done, abortion, vaccines, those kind of responses come in. And I'm sure that when they come in, you probably learn even more each time they come in.
Yeah, no, totally. I learn a lot from our readers and from the people who take the time to respond. And it also makes it clear that people can see the exact same sentence and interpret it totally differently and have these really diametrically opposed perspectives on this thing that you wrote or this piece that you wrote. And that is almost freeing in a way. When I write an opinion or take a really strong stance on something, and half the responses are people accusing me of being a closet Trumper, and the other half are people telling me I'm a woke lib, I realize that it's the personal bias that people are coming to stories with that sort of orient them to the world. There's like a psychological phenomenon, a very real one that's been studied, where most of us believe that our views are the most common or most popular views. Whatever we hold to be true, we think that that's what most people also hold to be true. So when we encounter something that's in opposition to that, we think, oh, that person must be the kind of minority crazy position. Nobody's like, well, some people are, but most people are not like, oh, my position is nobody believes it, whatever. So it's cool to get that feedback from people and understand that, and then just be able to let go of worrying about how it's going to get received and kind of lean into I'm just going to say what I honestly think, and people can take it or leave it. And no matter what, I'm going to piss somebody off. Any effort I make to kind of not do that is sort of in vain anyway. So I might as well just be honest about what my view is.
Yeah. Which is why I love your sticky note about telling your truth, because to do what you're attempting to do, which is to be unbiased, independent, nonpartisan source, you have to be your own guide, and you can't allow the comments from anybody, or even the clicks, like you mentioned earlier. You can't allow that to influence you in a way that you start writing biased pieces, because that would go against the mission.
Yeah, no, 100%. And the audience capture is a real phenomenon where it's like you write something that your audience really loves, and so you just try and give them more and more of that and sort of leave behind your own sort of unique perspective. So it goes both ways too. Even the positive feedback can be a trap, and you have to be careful of too, which I try and be really cognizant of as well.
Yeah, it's very dangerous. I've talked about this several times on the podcast, so people are probably getting bored of it, but it's this Lady Gaga idea of the fame monster. And I've noticed it in my world, which is in mostly investment type stuff, where really bright investors will write pieces that make them go viral, and they never write anything else again. They literally write the same kind of stuff over and over again, whether it's a tweet or whether it's their newsletter product or whatever. But there's something to it. Fame is consumptive, and people are operated on a subconscious level by these kind of positive reinforcement mechanisms. That's what created the media bias problem to begin with, as you mentioned earlier in this interview.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense.
So what's your vision for Tangle? Where do you go from here? Or what do you see happening over the next 4 or 5 years with Tangle?
Yeah. So look, I just now in the last few months have really locked in the team that I want. We got to a place, thank God, where we have some money in the bank and some money put away for a rainy day and a subscription base that's big enough to employ some people. So I very much feel like the core product, the core offering, which is the newsletter, is I don't want to say complete, but it's what it needs to be, and I think it's proven. And so we are entering the scale phase, which is what, like we talked about at the top of the show, we have roughly 65,000 people on our mailing list or whatever. I want that to be 1 million. I believe in the strength of having a large audience. And I think that if we had a really large audience, we'd be in a position to sort of really shift conversations in a way that I think would be much more productive, where my dream is there's a big contentious issue out there and people are sitting around reading news outlets and trying to understand what's going on. And there's this big chunk of the voting populace in America that's, I want to wait for Tangle to cover this. Like, I want this to get the Tangle treatment. The same way people used to say that maybe about 60 Minutes, or they want to hear Walter Cronkite cover the story, whatever. I want Tangle to have this place that people are waiting for us to cover it, to really feel like they have a good grasp of it. I think that's like an awesome North Star, big pie in the sky vision. And then we're expanding, we're moving into other platforms, obviously YouTube, podcasts, events. And one of the really big things that's on my roadmap over the next few years is actually getting Tangle into college classrooms, which is something that we're just getting off the ground this summer. I'm partnering with a professor from Georgia State University who has a poli-sci textbook, a digital poli-sci textbook. And we're sort of testing it, rolling it out with some summer courses that he has, which is basically the front end of the Tangle newsletter as it exists. And then instead of my take, some discussion questions that they work through together in the class. And I want to help grow the audience that's buying his textbook and maybe put Tangle in there and get some royalties or something, make it a business and kind of altruistic arrangement where we're getting Tangle in front of a bunch of students. Because fundamentally, I think it's really important that we also focus on the next generation of news consumers. I don't think that the 50 and up group is totally lost to the partisan noise, but I think they're very much entrenched in their political positions. And it's going to be really hard to break them out of their habits of reading or watching whatever news they get their news from. But we have this whole generation of people coming up who right now are getting 30-second TikTok clips for their news. And I want to get that generation on board with a more longer form nuance consumption of the news. And so classrooms, college and high school classrooms are a big target audience for me, and bringing in like a younger readership or viewership or whatever it is. And yeah, that's a big goal. So we're definitely entering the scale phase. I want to put some money back into advertising and growing the business and finding a new audience. And I'm hoping to just take what we have now and get it in front of much more people. That's the next chapter for us, I think.
Nice. And I love that vision about trying to reach the young people in this country. I think it's a great idea, and I think you're going to be successful. I mean, my take is that million reader goal is definitely attainable. I feel like there's some newsletters out there that are already of that size that yours is on the same level and providing similar information. So I feel like million, maybe even more. What was CNN's peak viewership? Do you know that number?
That's a good question. I know Tucker recently, before he got canceled, was polling something like 3 or 4 million people a night on average, which to me it's not the same 3 or 4 million people every night, but that's like 10% of the country or whatever. It's 300. I guess there's probably 250 million adults in the US now. Maybe, I don't know what the exact number is anymore, but if you're getting 3 to 5% of the voting population will watch your show every night, that's a pretty powerful thing. And for us, we really, at least from my perspective, I really believe that everybody right now, every American right now, has that voice in the back of their head that they don't totally trust the information that arrives in front of them, whether it's television news or New York Times or Wall Street Journal, whatever it is. I think everybody's sort of like, they're scratching that itch with social media, with sort of niche YouTubers, with whatever they go out to sort of get this kind of alternative flavor of the news. I think more and more people are doing that. And I just need Tangle to get as much exposure as possible. And obviously money helps. So subscribers and donations and all that stuff, we want to just dump that money back into advertising. But we're also thinking about ways to get people just talking about what we're doing. So it's like you're at the bar with your friend and they're talking about politics. You're like, hey, have you heard of this newsletter Tangle? We need that word of mouth to happen too. Coming on podcasts like this helps. I do every media appearance I get invited on because I think we have a important and good story to tell. And so, yeah, we feel really good about the product. And now it's just, how do we get this in front of as many people as possible?
I think I agree with your hypothesis. What you are doing is very important. We live in a very critical time. And I agree with your other hypothesis too, which is that there's a huge demand for this kind of thinking and this kind of content. And it just hasn't been put together because it's hard to put together. As you've shown, it's taken you 4 years to get where you are now. But I'm pulling for you. I really love your product and I appreciate you coming on the show. We will make sure that we share all the appropriate links. But I wanted to thank you for your time and look forward to staying in touch with you, Isaac. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, I appreciate it a lot, man. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for listening to the Nick Halera Show. We hope you enjoyed the episode and would appreciate your help with spreading the word by sharing with your network on social. And until next time, remember, it's not about pursuing success to unlock fulfillment. It's about learning how to find fulfillment in the midst of success.